Hi class. Today's topic is going to be theories. There are three main theories used in sociology. The first one is called structural functional theory. Sometimes it's called functionalism. The main premise behind structural functional theory is that all parts of society are working together for the good of society. Now, that's a really general view. All parts of society are working together for the good of society. But there's a more specific way you can use this theory, and I want to focus on that because it's a little bit more difficult to understand, and I want to give you a few examples. With structural functional theory, the title itself tells you about the main premise behind this theory, structural functional theory. They argue that we as a society create social structures that perform functions for the benefit of society. So let's talk about some social structures. When I say that, I'm not talking about a physical structure. I'm talking about a social entity. So those are things like healthcare, criminal justice system, even something smaller like gangs that I'm going to use for some examples. Okay, so let's talk about gangs. It's a social structure that arguably we have created for the benefit of society. If it wasn't beneficial, functionalists argue that we would get rid of it and it would cease to exist. So it must perform some benefit for society. Let's figure out what that is. Now, functionalists identify three different types of functions that can come out of a social structure. The first type is called manifest function. That is the planned, intended function of a social structure. So what's the manifest function of gangs? Now, if you think about it, it could be argued that it's a pseudo-family for people who maybe don't have a strong family environment. They're looking for a connection with a group of people. So sometimes gangs fills that void and it becomes a pseudo-family for individuals involved. So that's the manifest intended function. Functionalists also identify unintended functions that come out of a social structure. Those are called latent functions. So what's a latent function of a gang? Now you might think an unintended function, and you might just right away jump to crime and violence because that's what we associate with gangs. Well, that is correct. That's a latent function, but that's actually another type of function structural functionalists talk about. It's called a dysfunction. So I'll talk about that in just a minute. So can you think of an unintended function coming out of gangs that's not dysfunctional? Now, this is a little bit harder to come up with examples because they're unintended and they're less obvious. So let's think about what's something that's beneficial to society that comes out of gangs. Now, some people argue that the reason gangs still exist is because of the boost that they give to the economy. Now, we may not want drugs being sold and weapons being sold and things that we associate with gang activity, but some people argue that's why they're still around and they're allowed to exist, is because their activities, even though they're illegal and dangerous, still add to the economy in some way. You can also almost always use the example of jobs as a latent function of a social structure. Think about what kind of jobs have been created because of gang activity. Well, we're definitely keeping police in business, and we're definitely keeping the criminal justice system going with gang activity. So I don't know if you could go much farther with that. Maybe, I don't know if there's certain clothing attire that is so associated with gangs that it's boosted that particular attire. I right away think of bandanas, but that seems like kind of a small thing to argue that that's actually boosting or being beneficial to the society in some way. So this is something where it would be good if we had a classroom discussion to bounce some ideas off of one another. But those are some examples to get you started in thinking about the difference between manifest function, which is the planned intended function of a structure, and latent functions, which are those unintended functions. And then there's almost always dysfunctions, things coming out of the social structure that are unintended and also harmful to society. All right, let me give you another quick example before we leave this theory. Let's talk about the military. Well, actually, let me mention this, that your textbooks do a good job of talking about things like education and family and clearly identifying some manifest and latent functions. So that's why I wanted to bring in these two other examples, gangs and military, to hopefully get your mind thinking and trying to apply it to your daily activities and other social situations besides those listed in your textbook. So with the military, think about what is the manifest function of the military. Well, it's to protect the United States from foreign enemies. That's the obvious, easy to identify reason. It's called the manifest function. Now let's think about the latent functions. What are the unintended, less obvious benefits that come out of the military? And when I say benefits, I mean things that are beneficial to society. So some latent functions of the military could be jobs. Like I mentioned before, that's almost always a good example of a latent function. So, the military hires and provides jobs for more than just military personnel. You've got people who build housing on military installations. You've got people who deal with landscaping. Those aren't military personnel doing those activities. Those are additional people that have been hired. That's good for society. So let's think about another benefit. You could argue, this might seem funny, but you could argue that the military is very beneficial to the economy in regards to tattoo parlors. Now, it's not required that you get a tattoo to be in the military, but that's such a large part of the subculture of the military that I think they're adding quite a bit of business to tattoo parlors. So now let's think about some dysfunctions. What are some dysfunctions that could come out of the military? Well, the military is teaching every person that joins how to use a weapon. So you could argue maybe some crime and violence are coming out of the military, unintentionally, of course. Any dysfunction that you identify for a social structure is not intended. It would be an unintended situation. So that's a good time for me to mention right there that dysfunctions are never manifest dysfunctions. Dysfunctions coming out of a social structure would always be latent. Otherwise, we would not have created the social structure in the first place. We're not going to create something to be harmful to society. So hopefully those examples help clarify some of the key points of the structural functional theory. Now, the second theory I want to talk about is my favorite. It's called symbolic interactionism. The overall premise of this theory is that our daily interactions create our reality. Our daily interactions create our reality. Have you ever been talking with your friends and you mention something like, I don't like that type of food. I don't like sushi. And your friends that you're sitting there chatting with, all of a sudden are like, what? How can you not like sushi? Sushi's the best thing ever. It's so awesome. It's so great. All the different flavors. Oh, it's great. Have you ever tried sushi? Oh, I tried it once, but I didn't like it. It's got raw fish in it, and oh, that's gross. Well, your friends start going on and on about how great sushi is. Guess what? The next thing you know, you have a date planned to go out with your friends to get sushi. Now, why are you all of a sudden willing to have sushi when 5 minutes ago you weren't? It's because your daily interactions with people are helping to change your perception of things. And that's a good example, something as simple as food. You also might think this with, another example might be with TV shows, maybe cool cars, what's considered cool clothing, things that we think, oh, I decided myself that I am going to get involved in this behavior, or I'm going to like this thing or that thing. But if you think about it, and maybe think about it now, after you've seen this video, and in the next 24 hours, think about your interactions with people and think about, have their comments and their thoughts influenced my comments and my thoughts? So that's the overall premise of the symbolic interaction theory. Now, you can also use this theory more in depth by talking about what are the common symbols that we have in a society and how do they affect interaction. And that's where this theory gets its name. What are the symbols and how do they affect interaction? Now, you have to look at this from a cultural perspective because the shared symbols are going to be different, whether you're talking about American culture or Japanese culture or German culture. There's going to be different symbols that we may not all have the same definitions for. So you have to look at this within a culture. So let's think about some symbols in our culture. One that pops into my head right away is a wedding ring. That is a symbol that we have a shared definition for. That means to most Americans that you are committed to somebody else. Now, the next step with this theory that a lot of people forget about is how does that symbol affect behavior? Well, how does a wedding ring affect behavior? Well, hopefully it affects the person wearing the ring's behavior and that they're not going to go to a bar with their friend and sit on a bar stool and flirt with somebody else who's not their spouse. And hopefully it'll affect the behavior of somebody else who views the person wearing the wedding ring, where they're going to see it as that person's in a commitment. I notice that as a person in a commitment because we have a shared definition of that symbol. And so I'm not going to go over and flirt with that person, or I'm not going to accept the drink that they just bought for me. Another example of a symbol would be the Bible. The Bible has a shared definition within our culture. And now, how does that affect behavior? Well, what happens if you as a student take your Bible to class and put it prominently placed on your desk? Do you think people would treat you differently? Do you think that they would talk to you about it? Do you think that they might avoid you because they're afraid you're going to engage in a conversation with them about religion? So think about things like that. How do those symbols that we share a definition for affect behavior? Now, you can also talk about with symbols, those are things as simple as words. And now this is a good example of how this could be culturally specific. You know, when you look at the English language, there's American English and there's British English. And we have different words for different things. Things like suspenders in the United States are called braces in England. So that's just a simple example of how our words are also symbols. All right, our third and final theory for sociology is called the conflict perspective. Now, this theory is taken from the work of Karl Marx. Karl Marx was not a sociologist,
And we are not forcing him into our discipline. But because of his work looking at social inequality in the economy, sociologists have taken his views and turned it into a sociological perspective called conflict theory. The main premise in this theory is that there are two or more groups in conflict with one another over power. There is inequality in all aspects of our culture. And so conflict theorists look at those different social situations and explain behavior by looking at the battle for power that's going on. Now, key point with this theory. You do not just identify the groups in power, you have to take the next step, which is identifying the behavior that comes from that conflict. So let's talk about family. In one of your textbooks, in one of the classes, they talk about housework and trying to explain conflict theory of the family. That is an extremely specific way to apply that theory, and it leaves out several different ways you could use that in regards to the family. So let's think about the family. What are some groups that would be in conflict with one another? Well, husband, wife is easy to identify. What about parents and children? Do they see things differently? Sure. Is there a struggle for power between those two groups? Definitely, especially if you have teenagers. And what about between maybe wife and mother-in-law? That's a known area of tension in the family. You can also talk about tension between families, that competition between the Joneses situation. So now you need to take the next step and talk about how does that conflict affect behavior. So let's talk about between parents and teenagers. What are some ways that teenagers are trying to gain power? Well, they might want power by having more freedom. So what are some ways that they do that? Well, they might try to manipulate the parents by being very nice and kind and maybe doing some extra chores around the house to make their parents think that, okay, maybe Junior deserves a break. Okay, that behavior from Junior is not his normal behavior. So this conflict, this struggle for power is changing his normal behavior. So let's say the parents give Junior this extra little freedom. He goes out and stays out past curfew. Well, then what's happened now is Junior has somehow gained more power than the parent. So what does the parent do to try to regain the power? They ground Junior. So there's a behavior that comes from that struggle for power. And it's a continuous struggle. Conflict theorists say that it does not ever end. Because if you're the person with power, you will be struggling to keep it. And if you're the person without power, you will be actively trying to gain it. If you're the one with power and you lose your power, are you going to be happy? No, you're going to try to regain power in that relationship.
So you can use this theory with anything in society. You can use it between educational institutions, that basic rivalry between different universities. You could talk about politically between the two main political parties. You can even put it on a larger macro scale where you're talking about conflict between countries. So it's something that is very widely used in sociology. It's a very popular theory because it's simple and you can apply it to every particular social situation you could possibly imagine. So if you have any questions about the theories I've talked about today, please feel free to contact me. All right, have a great day.